We will now walk through the solution to exercise 5-10 on page 215 in the textbook. This problem requires us to compute the break-even point for a multi-product company. Here we have Lucky Products, which markets two computer games, Predator and Runway. Contribution format income statement for a recent month for the two games is given in the middle of page 215. The requirement is to compute the overall contribution margin ratio for the company. That is part 1. Alright, and that's the first thing we must do whenever you're going to calculate break-even point for a multi-product company. You need to know the contribution margin ratio for the total company. How that's done is you take, for all products, you take the contribution margin total divided by sales revenue for the total company. So contribution margin in total divided by sales revenue in total. In this problem, contribution margin total is $120,000. Total sales revenue is $150,000. We have a contribution margin ratio for the company of 80%. The next step, as required in the text, is to compute the overall break-even point for the company in sales dollars. And this is the actual next step that you have to take. In order to calculate break-even point for the total company, it's the same methodology as used to calculate break-even point for a single product. We take the fixed cost divided by the contribution margin ratio for the whole company. And we take the total fixed cost of the company, which is $90,000, and we divide that by the 80% contribution margin ratio that we calculated in part 1 of this problem. When we do that, we come up with break-even sales dollars for the total company of $112,500. So the break-even sales revenue is $112,500. Now that break-even point in sales dollars is the only correct break-even point in sales dollars if the sales mix remains the same between the two products that Lucky Products is selling. In other words, if you were to look at the original dollar sales of Predator and Runway, Predator had $100,000 of sales, Runway had $50,000 in sales, total sales $150,000. If you were to take Predator sales divided by the total sales, you would find 100 divided by 150 that 67% of all sales are attributed to the Predator video game or computer game. Whereas Runway, $50,000 of the total sales are attributed to that, divided by the total sales of $150,000, you end up with 33% of all sales being attributed to Runway. We then take that sales mix percentage and multiply it by the break-even sales dollars, which we found in part 2. We found that in order to break even, we need to have $112,500 of sales revenue. But we also need to have that sales revenue in the sales mix of 67% Predator, 33% Runway. When we do that, we need, as a result, $75,000 of Predator sales revenue, $37,500 of Runway sales revenue. We then determine, based on that, we take our sales revenue for Predator of $75,000, and we then need to determine, in order to, part 3 asks us to go through and recalculate the required income statement for this company at this overall break-even point through this contribution format income statement. In other words, prove out what we've done. And with sales revenue of Predator being $75,000, Runway $37,500, total sales revenue $112,500. We then need to determine the variable costs. What we do is we take the variable expenses in the same ratio that we had originally. If you were to look at the original problem, Predator variable expense ratio was 25%. In other words, their variable expenses for Predator were $25,000, sales revenue $100,000, therefore a 25% variable expense ratio. We'll apply that same 25% ratio to Predator with the new break-even sales figure of $75,000 to determine that our variable expenses will be $18,750. When you subtract those variable expenses of $18,750 from the $75,000 of sales revenue, you have contribution margin of $56,250. We do the same for Runway. Runway's sales revenue would be $37,500. We need to determine the variable expense ratio for the Runway computer game, and in the original information, variable expenses were $5,000 divided by total sales of $50,000. We have a variable expense ratio of 10%. If we take that 10% and multiply it by the $37,500 of sales revenue, we determine that variable expenses are $3,750. When you subtract those variable expenses of $3,750 from sales revenue of $37,500, you determine that contribution margin is $33,750. When you add the contribution margin for Predator to the contribution margin for Runway, you determine that the total contribution margin is $90,000. Fixed expenses are $90,000. Net operating income is $0, which is what you would expect because we are at the sales revenue for the break-even point, given this sales mix of 67% Predator, 33% Runway. This does it for our discussion of exercise 5-10.